I became a Christian when I was a senior in high school. The only church exposure I had was my Catholic grandparents on the one side of the family and my non-denom megachurch grandparents and aunt and uncles on the other side. And my parents weren't really religious at all. The church that I started out at was a small town conservative Baptist church. It was the church that I was attending when I started to read the Bible for the first time. For this church, as for most evangelical Christians, the way in which I was taught to get closer to God was by reading the inspired scriptures. The Bible was God's word, and so to get to know God, one had to read his word. I remember thinking to myself, I want to know the Bible so badly. I want to know everything that it says. I want to know what it all means. And so I was so eager to read it and to study it and to know it as well as I possibly could. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because that I thought in reading the Bible and getting to know that, I would get to know Jesus and I would get closer to him. So I started to read incessantly, monograph after monograph, commentary after commentary, article after article. I ended up going to a Bible school in Seminary where I learned the original languages, the Greek and the Hebrew, so that I could read it as the authors had originally written it. I was deeply invested in this mentality that the pinnacle of religious formation was Bible study. I was knee-deep in all of the major biblical debates about atonement theology, about the new perspective on Paul, about the quest for the historical Jesus, about Old Testament archaeology, and so on. I was excelling in all of these fields of intellectual study, and yet almost in exact proportion to the success of my studies, I was losing my faith in God and becoming less and less of a morally good person. My character from the beginning of my college career at a conservative Bible school had completely degenerated, and so had my faith in God. How did this happen? I was reading the Bible every single day. Why wasn't I being conformed to the image of Christ? Some Calvinists I knew started to imply that maybe I wasn't elect, because anyone who has a confrontation with the irresistible grace of God would not have gone that direction. When I was wrapping up my seminary career, I was a full-blown agnostic. What had happened? A lot had happened, and my crisis of faith was multifaceted, but one major component was that the Protestant conception of the Bible had set me up for failure. I'm going to address two significant factors as to why this happened, so hopefully you don't fall into the same pitfalls. The first problem is that the scriptures aren't as perspicuous as Luther had suggested they were. Most Protestants think about the Bible in a systematic way, and this is not inherently bad because we need to make sense of our world in a manner that is consistent and logical. But there's a problem when the system becomes absolute. To help you understand why Sola Scriptura turned me agnostic, I actually think it's important to briefly discuss the science behind ideology itself. Neuroscientists have observed that our brain is divided into two hemispheres. The right hemisphere is primarily concerned with taking in new information, while the left hemisphere is mostly concerned with categorizing and classifying that information in a manner that's consistent and understandable for us. For example, if you start learning a new song on an instrument, when you first start to learn the notes, it's your right brain that's doing most of the work. And when you have learned the notes and just start trying to master the song and doing it over and over in a consistent way, then it's your left brain that starts to take over. But there's a problem. Brain scientists have pointed out that when our brains have a consistent, systematic understanding of something, it neglects or downplays new information that challenges that system. This has been shown in some striking cases. In one classic example, a person for some emergency medical reason had to undergo a collosotomy, which is a surgery that affects the corpus callosum, which is the part of your brain that unites the two hemispheres. So what happens after the fact is that the two hemispheres don't communicate with each other anymore as they normally would. Information from the left eye is processed through the right brain and vice versa. So in one experiment, a split brain patient was shown a picture to the left eye, right brain, and let's say it was a snow scene, and then was asked by the scientist to pick a card that has an image associated with the original picture from an array of cards. The person cannot say what he saw because the right hemisphere cannot speak. That is a faculty of the left hemisphere. but he is able to correctly choose with his left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, an image of, for example, a shovel. The right hand and left hemisphere chooses an image at random and scores no better than chance. Now this is where it gets interesting. The scientists flashed an image of a snow scene to the right brain, and then a chicken to the left brain, and then asked the patient to pick a card with each hand. The hand associated with the right brain picks a snow shovel, and the left brain picks a chicken claw. When asked to explain the choices, the person easily explains that they picked the chicken claw because they saw a picture of a chicken. But when asked to explain why they chose the snow shovel, they rationalize some excuse to tie it in with the chicken picture. The patient, with complete certainty, convinces himself of something that isn't true. His brain makes something up to make the picture make sense within its preconceived conception of things. The researchers themselves conclude that without batting an eye, the left hemisphere draws mistaken conclusions from the information available to it and lays down the law about what the right hemisphere can know. Yet the left did not offer its suggestion in a guessing vein, but rather as a statement of fact. This is related to the phenomenon known as confabulation, where the brain, not being able to recall something, rather than admit a gap in its understanding, makes up something plausible that appears consistent to fill it. This is terrifying. We have a cognitive bias hardwired in our brains that makes consistency at the expense of accuracy. Our reasoning capabilities, therefore, have dangerous weaknesses. Now, if you've ever grown out of an ideology, this case might actually resonate with your own experience. It certainly did for me. We have a systematic way of viewing the world, and we ignore evidence that challenges that system, unwittingly. The only thing to break us out of it is to be confronted with evidence so compelling and irrefutable that it shakes us out of the complacency and certainty provided to us by our left brain. This can be tremendously stressful, and that's why people probably tend towards consistency, because it's much easier to act when we aren't constantly rethinking our fundamental presuppositions about reality. The first ideology that I adopted almost entirely was an evangelical Reformed Baptist perspective. I believed in penal substitution and the inerrancy of the Bible and all 5 pillars of tulip and all the rest. I remember reading the Bible over and over again and thinking to myself, I have everything right. Everything that I'm reading fits perfectly with my system of thought. I thought to myself that there is nothing that I am wrong about textually. I was absolutely certain of my Reformed Baptist interpretation of the text. I thought, I am reading the text as it's plainly written, and that's just what it says. And then I started to read the book of Romans in Greek. And I remember going through and thinking, none of this makes sense. I'm trying so hard to fit this book into my Reformed Baptist framework, and it just won't fit. My left brain was trying so hard to make it fit. It tried so hard to make it cohere with the information that I was presupposing, but it just couldn't. So I decided to try and ignore all of my Reformed presuppositions and just read Paul with as much of a blank slate as I could, as honestly as I could manage. I read him as plainly as possible, conscious of my biases, trying my best to let him speak for himself, and my attempt at an honest reading was fundamentally misaligned with my Reformed presuppositions. I realized that the system just didn't work, and it was too mentally laborious to uphold, so I abandoned it. And when I realized that the system that I had complete faith in was exegetically bankrupt, I lost faith in systems altogether. My entire epistemological method changed from systematic rationalism to empiricism. In other words, I stopped trying to find a perfectly consistent abstract system and instead just tried to establish undeniable baseline interpretive facts and build my way up from there. This is still how my academic method largely operates. Such a method, in my mind, would be more accurate on the whole, taking into account facts that systematicians often downplay or ignore, while being more apparently inconsistent and ambiguous. I figured if I am confident in fact A and in fact B, and yet they appear to contradict each other, I would rather hold to the seemingly irrefutable facts than propose system C that calls for me to either ignore A or B, assuming that there is some explanation as to how these seemingly contradictory things are reconciled, but acknowledging that I may not have all of the data or even the intellectual capacity to reconcile them myself. This seemed to me to be the best method for avoiding the intellectual pitfalls that we observed before. So I set out to shed the system of thought that I thought had biased my readings of the text and pursue their apparent plain meaning. In seminary, I studied under a professor who is probably one of the most empirically honest historians and exegetes that I have ever encountered. He was the perfect intellectual instructor for me at this time because his method was almost exactly the same as the one that I had just adopted for myself. His works effortlessly pointed out interpretive biases and showed plain facts that had often been unwittingly suppressed because of commitments to ideology. He was also quick to concede wherever an answer to an interpretive question simply eluded our grasp. For example, we once went over what Jesus might have meant by turn the cheek in Matthew chapter 5. Some historians argue that Jesus was giving a political message, basically telling the Jewish people not to revolt against the Romans because it would end up in catastrophe. Some philosophers, like Tolstoy, thought of turning the cheek as an absolute philosophical principle that must be observed in any and all cases. Some argued that it was only meant for individuals who are being attacked personally, but did not prohibit retaliation when others were being attacked. Still others argued that this command was intended only for the private person, but did not apply to governmental bodies who had permission to take violent action for the sake of justice. This professor pointed out that in the text itself, there's not enough data to conclude any which way. The fact is that the historical context in which Jesus himself gave this command is lost to us forever. The literary context in which Matthew has placed the Sermon on the Mount is an anthology of Jesus' sayings that have been strung together, probably in a manner that makes it easiest to memorize, meaning that there is not really any literary context in the passage to help us interpret it. There is just not enough data present in the text to yield a decisive interpretation about what the author originally meant. Any one of the above interpretations could be correct, but we just don't know, and not only that, we can't know what the author originally meant, because it's lost to history. And this can have dramatic ramifications, because this is a very important verse that tells us how we're supposed to deal with violence. But this professor's mentality was very persuasive. Suddenly it became clear to me the scripture seemed clear to Luther because he had an entire medieval textual tradition that provided him with a web of unconscious presuppositions that made him think the text was perspicuous. But it wasn't. Just me and my Bible, studying as rigorously as I possibly could, made me realize that ascertaining the authorial intent of a given passage was often impossible. To be honestly Sola Scriptura meant that one had to become incredibly agnostic. One had to admit that he could not know much of what the Bible originally meant. He could put forward a reasonable interpretive guess, but at the end of the day, that's all they were, just guesses. It was hard to take the Bible seriously as an authoritative source when the greatest scholars in the world were telling me that it was fundamentally ambiguous. And even the most seasoned scholars were unable to know what much of it meant. The Protestant emphasis on the individual person's ability to reasonably interpret his Bible on his own to derive its self-evident meaning had led me into agnosticism. This, in my opinion, is the logical conclusion of Sola Scriptura without the guide rails of church tradition. The second element that is worth discussing is something that I find especially common in Reformed theology, which is the circles that I used to pretty much run in which the intellectual study of the Bible is made central. It is deeply embedded within the culture of Reformed circles that academic theology is the pinnacle of religious practice. I think that this is because, in their framework, salvation is received through faith alone. And having faith in heretical theology puts your salvation in jeopardy, so the most important thing for a Reformed Protestant to do is to iron out the most perfect theology that is possible for him to attain to ensure that heresy is as far from him as possible. You find that most Reformed leaders and even congregants that you interact with are intellectually quite arrogant, dogmatic, and oftentimes condescending. This is not everybody. I know some really great people in Reformed circles who are wonderful people and great friends of mine, but from my experience having hundreds of theological discussions for the last decade in Bible college and in seminary, talking to conservative Reformed Christians is almost always unpleasant. Arrogant, angry Calvinists is almost a cliche in Christian discourse. It was even observed as early as the 16th century. Erasmus said regarding them, "I have never entered their conventicles, but I have sometimes seen them returning from their sermons, the countenances of all of them displaying rage and wonderful ferocity as though they were animated by the evil spirit." Now let me be clear, I'm not talking about people on the internet who are universally terrible across denominations, even in Orthodoxy. I'm talking about real-life people that I have met in person. When I became Orthodox and started meeting actual Orthodox Christians in real life, the difference was clear. The aim of Orthodoxy was not to incessantly nitpick theology. We believed that our theology was pretty much ironed out in the ecumenical councils. The primary purpose of our faith was to form us into the image of Jesus Christ. Theosis was the goal, and it was evident. Church was not an intellectual exercise in which you were required to critically analyze the theological nuances of a sermon, but it is a heartfelt, reverent, and prayerful celebration of God's condescension to humanity. It was not intellectual, but practical and experiential. Likewise, my reading of the Bible changed when I left Protestantism. The emphasis became less academic, though I still study the Bible academically, but it became more mystical and focused on developing an experience of the living God. Experience is shunned in Reformed Christianity as a reaction against Catholicism and charismatic religion. Therefore, the mind is exalted to a height that does not benefit the formation of the soul. Bible reading in Orthodoxy is considered almost useless if it's not accompanied by intimate prayer, fasting, and acts of mercy and charity. Being theological is worthless if one is not actually being conformed to Christ. Heretics read the Bible, but it was the opinions of saints who bore the fruit of love that we actually trust and take seriously. If your exegesis does not lead you into love, into actual, real Christian love, I promise you your theology is bankrupt. Let me show this point further. If you asked a Reformed Christian who his favorite theologians are, he will probably tell you John Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, Karl Barth. If you ask him why he likes those theologians, they will probably tell you because they wrote really good theology books. If you ask what good things they did besides writing books, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you much of an answer because they kind of don't care. Reformed culture exalts people for their abstract ideas and not for their good works because of their pronounced emphasis on sola fide. Jonathan Edwards participated in chattel slavery at a time when other Christians like John Wesley were adamantly opposed to it and pushing for abolitionism. Karl Barth unashamedly had a long-term affair with his assistant pretty much in front of his wife and children. If you asked an Orthodox Christian who his favorite theologians are, you might hear John Chrysostom, who left his lucrative secular profession and lived as an ascetic for 5 years before he was made into a clergyman. When he became Archbishop of Constantinople, he did everything he could to support the poor, courageously preaching against the excesses of the imperial household, which ultimately led to his exile and his death. You might also hear St. Basil the Great, who established the first real hospital called the Basilade, which would indiscriminately help the sick no matter their religious beliefs. Basil himself would often personally feed and tend to them. Or perhaps you'll hear them say Athanasius of Alexandria, who not only wrote good theology, but suffered unjust exile for his orthodoxy 5 times and never recanted the truth. It's spiritually unhealthy to make intellectual prowess your chief Christian virtue. Theology must be accompanied by love, and Holy Orthodoxy does this better than anyone I've encountered because you aren't just reading the Bible to give yourself the best objective, abstract ideas, but in order to be conformed to Christ in the continual process of theosis. Sola Scriptura turned me into an agnostic. Cultural features of Protestantism, situated in a sola fide reading of the Bible, killed my spirituality, convincing me that biblical intellectualism could function as a substitute for actual virtue. This is not to say that all Protestants will become agnostic and immoral, but to say that there are foundational elements of the Protestant faith, especially in the Reformed Church, that set people up for failure. I think that the only solution to this is to embrace tradition. not only for its interpretive guide rails to stave off agnosticism, but also for the value that it places on actually reforming character through its numerous disciplines that are completely foreign to most lay Protestants. I hope that whoever you are, you can avoid the same pitfalls that I fell into. Join me next time for a more complete rebuttal of the Sola Scriptura doctrine, but I hope that these reflections on my own journey within Protestantism and into Orthodoxy have been helpful for you. Thanks for watching.